a number of parents have been very concerned about their children contracting the virus in school. Having this vaccine, this will give both the kids, parents, and teachers peace of mind.
Welcome to the RANE Insights on COVID-19 podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Let's listen as RANE founder David Lawrence speaks with Drs. Fred Southwick and Bill Lang for our weekly coronavirus update.
Bill and Fred, thank you again for joining us. We have a lot to talk about today. When we concluded our podcast last Friday, the CDC had not yet issued their approval, and now we seem well on our way to approval and authorization of vaccines for children 5 to 12. So I thought we'd start with those two topics and get your views on it.
So as we know when we talked last week, the FDA Advisory Committee on Vaccines had recommended approval, and the FDA did in fact authorize amending the emergency use authorization so that the vaccine could be used as a booster, and we talked about when the booster could be applied. The CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices validated that, no significant changes to that. So basically, it's anybody who is over 65 or has a risk factor, either a medical risk factor or an exposure risk factor, which is very important, is recommended to have a booster if you got one of the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer or Moderna. But then anybody is recommended to get a booster if you had the Pfizer vaccine. And in fact, the J&J vaccine, yes. And in fact, there is a lot of discussion that in some areas there's a consideration that should that actually be considered a two-shot primary series. In other words, if in order to be considered fully vaccinated, you need to have 2 doses of the J&J vaccine. That has not been done, but that is actively under discussion. So then the second major development was that the same FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, they will be meeting next week to discuss the Pfizer vaccination in the 5 to 11-year-old age group. On Tuesday, the advisory committee, they voted without objection to recommend that authorization. Let me start over on this segment. I messed this one up. So the second major development is that the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee met earlier this week to address vaccination for the 5 to 11-year-old age group. And on Tuesday, this advisory committee voted without objection. There was one abstention, but they voted to recommend the authorization in this 5 to 11-year-old age group. Next week, the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices is scheduled to meet, and it is expected that they are also going to take this up. And typically the CDC director will sign off on their recommendation. So we could expect that by roughly the 8th of next month, so not this coming Monday, but the following Monday, we'll start doing vaccinations for children ages 5 to 11. And that's in addition to 12 to 18 that were authorized a couple of months ago. So what that's going to mean is all children except for the youngest that are in school are going to be eligible for vaccination. That's going to be a big change as we get towards second semester, because as you know, the vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine is the only one that's being considered. It's 3 weeks between the 2 vaccinations, and then it's another 2 weeks until you're considered fully vaccinated. And if you just run the timeline on that, what that means is for the Thanksgiving holiday, is no kids that age will be considered fully vaccinated, but by Christmas, and then certainly by the start of the new school semester, many children will be fully vaccinated going into the second semester.
Yeah, I think this is a very important development. And in talking to parents, what this will mean for those that a number of parents have been very concerned about their children contracting the virus in school or when they're playing with their friends. And having this vaccine will dramatically reduce the risk. It's a 90%, 91% efficacy for symptomatic disease protection. This will give both the kids, and parents, and teachers peace of mind, and that these kids will be protected. And I think that's very important. One of the problems we've gotten into is a lot of people have underestimated the number of children that have been infected. And it's my understanding, and Bill, you can correct me, but I think approximately 1/3 of children in the United States who are in school have become infected. And that's a very significant number. And although the complications are relatively rare, there have been severe cases of multi-systems inflammatory disorder, and there have been some deaths, not a huge number, but any death in a child is devastating, and we really should never find that acceptable.
No, but the other part of the consideration is, while we want to make sure that we're avoiding all of these potential bad outcomes, we don't want to be causing bad outcomes, because while those things Fred just listed can happen, the reality is most kids do very well. In fact, many kids probably have had COVID and we never knew it because it was just another sniffles that they had. But fortunately, in this authorization run-up studies, they had zero significant adverse events. Now, this is not a huge study. There's only a few thousand kids that were involved in the study. So when we start getting millions of kids immunized and watching what happens in the post-authorization monitoring is going to be of critical importance. But so far, so good. The bar is very, very high for children. The same reason we don't want to have children to have bad outcomes, we don't want to have them have a serious adverse reaction to a vaccine. So fortunately, so far, the vaccine is clearing that bar.
Bill, I completely agree. And one of the reasons we think that there haven't been as many side effects due to the vaccine is you're using 1/3 the dose that were used for adults. And I think that is very important. It seems like it's the second dose, after the second dose, that young men in the age 12 to 6 to 17 year old actually had some myocardial inflammation. But the good news is with that group was they were very responsive to corticosteroids, and the course was very short, 2 to 3 days, and very rarely was there any permanent damage to the heart.
I've listened carefully to some of the interviews given by the doctors on the FDA panel that approved both the booster as well as they're examining the benefits for children. And they spoke, I thought, very eloquently about the calculus that they deploy about, risks and benefits. And I know you have spoken about that as well for all age groups. And they also spoke about how the FDA's mission is not to take a review of a snapshot in time in terms of what the data is saying. And, as both of you said, it's a bit, the data set is a bit limited for the youngest age group, but how the FDA continues to track the data, monitor that, et cetera. Maybe you can speak, because I think these are important points for the audience to understand, sort of the calculus and how approval is weighed, and then also how it continues to be monitored by not just the FDA, but I guess also, other health bodies such as the CDC.
David, this is actually a kind of interesting point, because the FDA is mandated to look at any biological or medication and what is the effect on the individual, and do a risk-benefit assessment for the individual. And so what they're looking at is they look at what is the risk if somebody gets COVID, and what are the possible diseases, bad outcomes that they could have if they get COVID. And they compare that against the risks that they are calculated from the studies, and from also looking at the experience with other age groups with the vaccine, and they do a comparison. So it's very much, as I understand the FDA process, it's very much at the individual that they're looking. The CDC, however, has a different remit. They are charged to look at the public health. So certainly they have to look at the effect on the individual, but they also are the ones that have to say, like if we take in, there's been other somewhat controversial vaccinations, HPV vaccine that for young males has almost no benefit, direct benefit for the male, but the public health value of it is immense. And the CDC is charged to look at the public health value also. So that's why it's very useful to have these two bodies that have different they're this very similar memberships to their advisory committees, but very different lenses that they're looking at the biological or the medication through.
Yeah, and I think in both settings, the vaccine is the risk-benefit ratio, the benefit far outweighs the risks. And with regards to the Delta variant, although there haven't been good published studies about household contacts and the likelihood that if a child comes and brings the Delta variant into the house, what percentage of individuals will become infected, based on the India experience and a number of friends of mine whose kids came home, it's almost 90% of family members became infected when an index case comes into a household. So that's a tremendous benefit if in that house there is someone who's a significant risk, immunocompromised or over age 65. And we're seeing that particularly over age 80, even if you're vaccinated, there's a significant risk of death if you are exposed again in large doses to the Delta variant.
And can you guys speak to the second part of my question, which is how the FDA is not taking a snapshot in time, but continues to monitor the data and continues to assess both safety and efficacy?
Well, sure. Traditionally, the FDA has used the VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Reaction Monitoring. I'm going to blow that. VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Event Response System. I apologize for that. And what that is a voluntary reporting system. So it's often been criticized in that it is much more of a passive system. So a physician or other treating provider actually has to take the time to make a report if they observe a problem with one of their patients having had a vaccine. In the case of the COVID vaccination, however, there have been multiple very systematic positive outreaches by both state health departments and the CDC to get a much more broad base. No one would say that they're picking up every adverse event, but they're picking up enough, and they have both numerator and denominator data that they have a good idea of what the actual rates are of these. And these various vaccine advisory committees, both at FDA and CDC, are reviewing the data on an ongoing basis, and if they saw a problem, they would make the change.
Yeah, one of the examples is the abnormal thrombosis, particularly of central nervous system vessels, was picked up by the VAERS very quickly with a relatively low signal, and that was with the J&J, and also was picked up in Europe in the AstraZeneca. But what that tells you, it's a very sensitive tool, particularly now where everybody is attuned to the issue of side effects, and a lot of people know about the VAERS. Particularly, I find those that are anti-vaccine are always pointing to the VAERS because they can go in and look at the raw data. The problem with the raw data is that when you vaccinate a huge population, there will be various diseases in that population that have no relation to the vaccine. But if you're not sophisticated in analysis, you'll say, oh, the vaccine caused that. And that's where it's really important. The analysis, the statistical analysis required to prove or to suggest cause and effect has to be very carefully performed.
David, one other issue that I'd like to address, just because I'm getting a lot of questions about it, and I'm hoping Fred may be able to comment on this one too, is Delta Plus. There's a lot of people start hearing about this Delta Plus, or it's AY.4.2, that is causing about 10% of all COVID infections in the UK right now. And there's a question of, is the persistent elevated level of COVID illness in the UK due to this AY.4.2 or Delta Plus? So I've spent some time looking at that just today, actually, and there is no evidence whatsoever that it causes more severe disease or that it is escaping vaccine coverage at all. It's about, from that standpoint, it seems to be identical to Delta. There is evidence that it is slightly less than 10% more infectious than Delta, but at 10%, that's typically not a level that is going to cause a huge difference. It's just, what it's going to do is just slowly replace the original Delta, will be replaced with the Delta AY.4.2 as the predominant strain that is in circulation. So nothing looks that scary about this one at this point, but if you go into the news, you're going to see lots of scary stories out there. I don't think that we need to be, it's like so many things, you want to watchfully wait for it, make sure that nothing is changing, but so far it does not look like this is a dangerous variant at all.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, Bill, because I have friends who are in London and they're talking about sort of how everybody is interacting. It's almost like COVID is over completely. And I'm just curious whether part of what you're seeing might be related to, what I'll refer to as aggressive normalcy.
Oh, very much so. This is not the increased case rates in the UK are not due to AY.4.2. They're due to people living their lives.
Yeah, I think that pubs are probably one of the perfect sites for spreading the virus, and we all know that those in Great Britain love their pubs, and they're there drinking without masks, talking, singing, creating aerosols everywhere, and the Delta variant really is much more infectious than the original. And even if you have the vaccine, if there's one person in that bar that's unvaccinated, there can be breakthrough infections as a consequence. And I think the Delta Plus just happened to be at the right place at the right time. It probably it's not as significantly worse than the standard Delta, and it's more of a coincidental effect rather than really dominating the way the Delta variant did, when you saw a very rapid rise, and it went from 5% to 20% to 80% within a very short period. And that's not what's happening with this Delta Plus variant.
Okay. I want to switch gears just a little bit with both of you, because we've spoken, obviously there's a biological aspect to this pandemic, but there's also political, informational, and psychological. And we're seeing some things play out right now. I don't want to get into the politics. It's we're agnostic on this podcast, except as to what the data actually shows, whether it's in terms of the spread of the disease or the efficacy of the vaccine and the safety. But what is happening now is interesting. A number, at least here in New York, there's a vaccine mandate. We'll see what happens to the compliance rates, but obviously there are a number of challenges that continue in court, and even people who are vaccinated have a certain degree of solidarity with people who choose not to be vaccinated. And you're seeing this play out in some of the union representation and things like that. And Fred, I'm not picking on your state, but before this podcast, you and I were noting that some people in political office, go unnamed, not important, are actually reaching out in Florida and say, come on down here where there is no mandate. And just sort of curious because there are intelligent people on the non-vaccination side. They're reaching their conclusions for whatever reason. But I'd be interested, because you have focused on vaccine rates, and now we're getting into the area of people getting a booster. How is this all going to play out, do you think?
Well, I am very concerned about this trend. And, one of the problems is that it appears that people are choosing what they call freedom over actual safety to themselves. We know that, my understanding from listening to news, that 60% of deaths among policemen in the New York area has been due to COVID-19. It's the leading cause of death, and yet a significant percent of these police officers are ignoring that really important and frightening statistic and insisting they should be free to choose not to be vaccinated. The other concern I have is that those that work in policing and those that are emergency responders and fire department, they come to people that are in distress and have to help them. If they are carrying the virus when they come to help them, they could actually kill them. So if your goal is to help people and protect people, then I would think that you would want to become vaccinated so you never would give the virus to the people you're trying to help. So from my standpoint, the mandate is a logical extension to to really insist that everyone do the right thing when it comes to protecting the public and protecting all of their fellow workers. But Bill, you have a little bit different take on this.
I do. I think there's no disagreement between us on the importance of vaccine and the value of vaccine. I think that a lot of the concerns that people have about vaccines, so it's important to listen to these concerns, but when you step back dispassionately and look at the risks on both sides of the equation, I've looked at this very in depth. I just don't understand how you can look at the risks on both sides and come up with a conclusion that the vaccines are not beneficial for almost everybody. Yes, there's going to be a few people that should not get the vaccine, but that's a really tiny number. The issue that I have is that that what we've seen over history is that when you mandate vaccines, there are a lot of people who actually, they become less likely to get vaccinated when you use a mandate as opposed to a educational program, incentive-based program. You try to bring people along. You say, look, I understand what your concerns are. Let's talk about what my concerns are as the head of the department or whatever it may be, and the reasons why we need you to get vaccinated, and then take an outcomes-based approach. If you say that, hey, look, we can't have you working in our emergency room if you're still vaccinated. It's not, if you're not vaccinated, we'll find something else for you to do. It's like you said, you worry that you have police officers that are, or medical first responders that are going to be going out there and they're going to be working face to face, up close and personal with people, and could possibly transmit the vaccine to them. The virus to them. Well, then take them out of those positions for a period of time. Eventually, most people are going to come around. And I think that doing kind of an outcomes-based approach as opposed to a upfront mandate is in the long run going to have a better effect. One of the big concerns right now, looking at New York City specifically, is that all leaves and vacations for police, fire, emergency, EMS, and sanitation workers have now been canceled as of Monday, because they know that they're going to be losing between a quarter and a third of their workforces. So they're going to have to make everybody else work harder. So the second order effects and higher order effects of having the mandate for vaccination is going to go much, much farther beyond the number of people who would be injured by potentially infected workers, because we're not going to have enough cops, firefighters, emergency responders, and sanitation workers out on the streets.
Yeah, so Bill, I don't want to lose the thread of that last point, which is important. This whole pandemic has involved cost-benefit analysis, and I think you guys have been particularly mindful of it. And that includes the costs of developmental issues of kids going to school, the loss of jobs, the loss of productivity, et cetera. And the point you're making here, I just wanted to underscore it for the audience, is that basically, if in fact 20 or 25% of the police, fire, sanitation workforce does not show up in a municipality, that creates its own set of dangers, risks, and potential for loss of life and damage to people. So this is a very, very complex problem. At some point, maybe an economist will receive a Nobel Prize for ability to measure all the factors in a pandemic and vaccine rollouts. But that was a very important point. Let me, in the few minutes we have remaining, I'd love to get your views, because I think something is changing with respect to vaccines for 5 to 11, 11 to 17 or 18, and those demographics. And that is, this is very informal by me, but I've had a chance to have enough conversations. The conversation about whether to be vaccinated or not and the administration of the vaccine is very often taking place between I'll call it the young adult or child, and his or her pediatrician. And that's a very different conversation than what we've been having with adults. And I'd like to get your thoughts about whether that makes a difference. We talked about the loss of a personal relationship with physicians as part of modern medicine, at least in this country, and how that's had a negative impact on people and sort of how they care for themselves. But there seems to be a very different dynamic going on involving families, their children, and the pediatricians. And just any thoughts you might have on that.
Well, I'm a family doc, and so that the whole idea of that relationship is still critically important. And I think the pediatricians, I know my colleagues are pediatricians, and the pediatric nurse practitioners and pediatric PAs that work with them, they do still have that relationship. And part of it is because they see kids, as babies, they're seeing them every couple of months. And then even as the kids get older, they're seeing them at least typically once a year, maybe once every 2 years. So they do have this personal relationship they develop with the kids and the parents. So I think that is very important. But what that also means is that one of the most important things that CDC and the health departments can be doing is outreach to these pediatricians to make sure, pediatricians, pediatric nurse practitioners, pediatric PAs, to make sure that these people have their questions answered. I'd like to say that they're on board, but I think we're talking about professionals. It's really answering their questions and leading them to be on board. That is to me the most important thing that they can be doing right now to get the kids vaccinated. Because remember, we're still, as a country, we're at less than 60% of the country fully vaccinated. I think the latest numbers are 50, actually I can tell you here in a second, I think it's 52%, or 56.2%, 57.6% is the latest number of fully vaccinated. When we add in these kids, and if we can get a high percentage of them, kids 5 to 12 are about 7% of the population. If we could get another 5%, 6%, and suddenly now we're up to 65-ish% of the population vaccinated, well, that's the level at which Israel and Japan have started to see what you could say is effects of herd immunity that we're not seeing in the U.S. yet. So that could be a huge help.
Yeah, pediatricians, I actually talked to one just 2 days ago, and what they say is they have to address this. They've had to address this with other vaccines, the influenza vaccine, the Hib vaccine, multiple vaccines. So they are used to having this conversation with the parents and the children. And the bill has alluded to this. You can't lecture to them and say they have to get it. You have to convince them, and you have to be very respectful and listen to their concerns, be empathetic, and point out the advantages of the vaccine and make it a teaching moment and not an ordering moment. And so the good news is pediatricians are used to doing this and have actually developed a good skill set for communicating with parents and children to advance the use of the COVID-19 vaccine.
And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say not just pediatricians, but the family docs that are out there also. I get shot by my colleagues for not saying.
Hear, 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 hear. Absolutely. And internists too.
Well, they're not saying too many kids though, but they need to do all the rest.
No,
of
that's true. But for the adults, they
yes,
have to
exactly.
have
Yes,
the same conversation.
Very enlightening. And again, what I was trying to tease out of all of you is that the messenger matters in these instances, and when there's a pre-existing relationship based on trust, it's a different conversation. And as you rightly said, this is not you have to listen to people. You can't tell them what they have to do. You have to explain calmly the potential benefits and the risks around things so that people are comfortable with the decision. So in any event, guys, thank you very much. I want to give the audience a little bit of a tip-off. I'm going to be leaning in with Fred and Bill to start to pull together lessons from the pandemic, because both of them have, being the sage physicians that they are, they know this is not going to be a one-time event, and quite frankly, when it occurred, it was not the first of its kind. And there are important lessons to learn and important lessons to remember and incorporate so that next time we can be better prepared and obviously be in a better position to respond more quickly and with greater efficacy, and obviously avoid some of the mistakes that we've incurred during this now almost 2 years. So Bill and Fred, thanks so much. I look forward to the continued conversation, and I know you'll continue to monitor the data for us over the next week and any new breakthroughs. So thanks again. Stay safe.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
Dr. Bill Lang is an expert in public health responses to biological incidents, including pandemics. Dr. Fred Southwick is an infectious disease specialist at the University of Florida College of Medicine. Both doctors are part of the RANE Expert Network. Individuals and organizations turn to RANE for risk intelligence that cuts through the hype to focus on what they need to know, what to expect, and what to do. Sign up for our coronavirus solution and get critical information on the COVID-19 pandemic delivered daily. Visit us at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.